Hey everybody, Morrissey here with this week's talk through for chapter 14 and a couple of basic points about what we're going to be doing this week. First of all, a reminder that this week's quiz will include last week's content from Scott, which I believe is just chapter 13. Yep, chapter 13. And the videos from last week. And the content and the additional reading from Lipsitz for the content for this week. So be prepared for all that. Maybe reacquaint yourself with that before you take the quiz. What else do we have? Oh, this week's also a little different. Honestly, I didn't find that much on the web that I thought was really powerful or good. So not a lot of videos to watch this week. So use the time wisely to get caught up in whatever you need to in this class or other classes. Read the Lipsitz article. There will be some questions off of that on the quiz for sure. And we'll get back into some more videos next week for the final week of our time together. The other thing is apologies for posting this on the latter part of Sunday night. So if that gets any of you behind, hopefully the shortage of videos will compensate for that. So my apologies. I was out of town and didn't bring the book or anything. So I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving and are feeling good about finishing out the semester. And it can be a rough time, so take care of yourselves in physical, spiritual, emotional, academic, all those senses. Get your rest, say your prayers, do your studies, and work out too. You can squeeze that all in, right? Do the best you can, and I certainly hope and pray that you'll do well yourself. And soon enough, it'll all be over, and Christmas will be here. Yay! So let's do the walkthrough for chapter 14. Shouldn't take too long. And then I'll post a couple more videos giving you some guidance on the Lipsitz reading and as well as chapter 13. Okay. So social development, starting off on page 281 here. Oops, I'll bring the book over here so I don't have to rotate my head so much. Starts thinking about, as we wrap up the course, some responses to common things that we may have heard or may have said ourselves in terms of how people think about their accountability for, given that there are these problems, these collective problems, how do people think that they may or may not be responsible? So that's an interesting thing to think about, and the warning not to be indifferent from Elie Wiesel, which is an interesting thing to think about too, that the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. Turning to page 282, introduction to the topic of social development and racial justice. You'll notice, perhaps a little frustratingly, and I'm a little frustrated with it myself, that she defines social justice several times throughout this book. So we're not going to be worried too over much about really coming down with specific definition for it, but it's useful to think about in a variety of ways. That just lets us, the different definitions let us see different things that are components or parts of what it means to have social development, or to have a lack of social development, which of course is the real problem, right? So on 283 in the text there, she categorizes it into three things. And that's the first beginning there. Then she introduces the concept of racial justice, which is an interesting thing to think about, and perhaps not something that's commonly thought about. Is the dismantling of racial domination, which of course means that people as a group are having collective advantage in getting their will done over another group. All right. Social justice, a big part, frankly, of the Catholic tradition and Catholic social teaching, CST, which unfortunately is maybe some people refer to as the best kept secret of the Catholic Church, that there's a specific body of teachings that tend to be a little less theological in nature, though they're informed by theology, by ideas about God that inform social justice. And so that there's a lot of statements by the bishops and by the Pope and by various priests and things like that that inform their various Catholic ideas about social justice. And so part of your Catholic education should be specifically focused, or you should at least be aware of that there's that part of the Catholic tradition. And that informs a lot of things. I mean, Catholics and officials of Catholics and individuals, Catholics or different groups within the Catholic Church, have different positions on different things, ranging from the more commonly known ones, say, for example, abortion or gay marriage. They also have less commonly known ones that you may not be so familiar about, sort of consistent life ethic, for example, which informs both concerns about abortion, but also concerns about the death penalty. And so that the consistent life ethic, for example, would say that we shouldn't take away life, we shouldn't kill in any of those circumstances, either for unborn children or for those who have committed crimes, even heinous ones. So anyway, that's not a full exposition on that, but just an example of, on the one hand, the abortion being the fairly commonly known position of social justice by the Catholic Church, the position on death penalty a little bit less known, perhaps. I would say probably less known. Okay, so if you just Google that, honestly, you can find some like 2-page introductions and summaries that are quite readable and quite useful for just getting you a quick idea of where sort of the church falls out on issues of social justice. Okay. Timeline is always useful and interesting, and a surprising number of the questions come off that, so take a look at that. 282 and 33, turn the page to 284. We have some goals on that column for Desmond and Emmer Byers, goals for getting rid of racial domination. So it might be interesting to read about those real quick. They're not terribly difficult. Then they sort of encounter the topic of social development as economic development. And then sort of Scott wants to expand beyond just the economic development, though of course that's sort of basic or foundational in many respects, right? If we are hurting in the pocketbook areas or in the various things that money provides, of course that affects our social life. Turning the page to 286, these 6 aspects of social development I think are particularly useful in developing something broader than just the economic there on the far left column on 286. The cultural development, moral development, physical development, interpersonal development, political development helps us get a well-rounded sense of the various ways in which, through racial domination or ethnic domination, people can be fail to achieve racial justice and or social justice. Okay. So then we come back in the next column to asset building strategies for low-income groups. And again, it's important to think of both economic assets, which is perhaps the most, the thing that comes to your mind first, but there's also other assets in terms of cultural skills and abilities of groups and stuff, as well as interpersonal things that have huge impacts on how people develop and their sort of prosperity or well-being generally, right? Well-being being a good word that she uses at some point to sort of think about what is social development in the various ways that people can not be well or be well. All right. So then turning to 287, a little bit of the history of race, education, and social policy, which is a big thing we consider. It varies state by state, but generally, schools have historically been funded by property tax, which varies by municipality or school district, which tends to be impacted a lot by people's wealth, which of course overlaps, as we've known, with race, not consistently, but generally. And so that this is one way that education impacts social development or lack of social development. Interesting thing on education, inequality, and race on 289. Something to think about for all of us, but especially for our education folks. So the treatment here is fairly fast and furious. So the distinctions and the points are pretty basic, but it is interesting to think of the distinctions between inside and outside the school system. Turning page to 290 and 291, thinking about both health policies and education with a specific history of Native Americans above, and healthy food initiative below. So then the struggle for sort of people getting healthy food in lower economic regions, as well as different racial communities and stuff. Okay. And let's jump to 292 and new 293. and consider this interesting case for all you guys in healthcare, which is another way in which culture can really impact. So you can have a cultural competency. It's a specific example of Dominicans, which may not be that useful for those of you working in the Fort Wayne area. I don't know what the Dominican population is. I mean, they tend to be very specifically heavily in New York City, as these pages say. But anyway, something to think about. So that in order to treat this health problem, it takes sort of some appreciation of the ways in which medical doctors or nurses or other, folk people in the Western healthcare system sort of feel disrespected by people who have a traditional way of healing. At the same time, the traditional healers, the curanderas, also feel disrespected, and so there can be some lack of communication and lack of respect going on that actually ends up hurting people because these two authority systems for healthcare, right? So the Western medicine versus the curandismo. Did I say that right? Curanderismo? Yeah, close. Curanderismo. I actually speak a little bit of Spanish, but often with a bad accent. In order to serve people well, they need to have some sort of communication and mutual respect. And that is actually often quite difficult. And so figuring out how to do that is the best way to treat people and to alleviate suffering in the world. So a very good thing to think about. And even if you don't have Dominicans, you can start thinking about the very specific sort of cultural and ethnic differences in people with sort of traditional medicines and or reasons to distrust Western medicine, or both. So that curanderismo is not only a thing for Dominicans, it may be different in practice. I'm no expert on this, but it's certainly a thing for many Latinos. I know there's sort of a practice of this in Mexico, for example, so that if you have Hispanic patients of various kinds, you might need to just be aware of sort of, even if they're seeing you in the healthcare system, they might be seeing some traditional healers as well. And rather than just turning a blind eye to that, it might be interesting to you to talk to the person about how they want to do both and be aware of the cases when maybe both won't work together too well, or maybe even to talk to the traditional healer and sort of have some sort of understanding about how they might be able to do both or support each other's work, right, or something like that. Because you may be trained in Western medicine, but at the end of the day, if this other system of healthcare is undermining what you're trying to do, or leaving people with difficult choices between two systems, that could be alleviated, it might be a good thing just to try to work towards that. So it's another idea of cultural competencies. And that's sort of basically the last two pages. Just take a look at that. I have not, of course, stressed conflict versus functionalist theory versus critical race theory for a variety of reasons, but just take a look at that, and that ends up wrapping up our chapter. So thanks so much, and more to come.